Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am O'Brien McMahon, and this is People Business. In this episode, I'm joined by Cheryl Fields Tyler, who is the founder and CEO of Blue Beyond Consulting. Cheryl's focus over 30 years has been building organizations where both the business and people thrive. Her distinct, innovative, and practical perspective has been featured in various media, including CNBC, BBC, Fast Company, and Forbes. In 2020, she received the For All Leader Award from the Great Place to Work Institute. And under her leadership, Blue Beyond has been repeatedly recognized as one of the best small and medium workplaces by Fortune and as an Inc. 5000 company. They, among other things, do some research on what employees are looking for in the workplace. And that is what we dive deep into today. And we kind of cover this in two different ways. One is just what do people want in general? And then how does that break out among the different generations? And it was interesting to have the conversation around what do the generations all want? And, what are these basic human elements of what we want from work? And then what are really the differences between generations? And does it have to do with the fact that they're different generations or the fact that they're just different ages and stages of their lives? So fascinating conversation, really enjoyed it. And there's a ton in here that I think you will enjoy as well. Here is Cheryl Fields Tyler. Cheryl, welcome to the show. Excited to have you on. Made even more excited because I've had a little bit of a LinkedIn back and forth with a friend of mine who's another former guest of the show, James Hornick. And there's been an article going around about Gen Z and about how it's some clickbaity headline like 60% of managers are firing Gen Z employees right after hiring them. And it's when you dive in, it's just like totally not true. But I think it's just a great example of how, again, clickbaity this topic of generations in the workplace can get. Yeah. And so I want to put the pressure on you to clear some of it up for the audience today.
We'll do our best. Thanks for having me on, O'Brien.
Can you just give a little bit of an introduction for yourself? Just what is your work origin story and what kind of work are you doing today?
Sure. Well, Cheryl Fields Tyler, I started a company 18 years ago called Blue Beyond Consulting. But before that, I was in research and consulting and policy stuff, mostly coming up in the high-tech industry. And, started my own company really out of a desire, O'Brien, for really two things. One is just personal, like work-life integration, all that good stuff, right? But beyond that, it was really, I was advising businesses all the time on here's what to do to build an organization where both the people and the business thrive. And I kept wondering, I wonder if I actually could do that myself. Like, am I willing to drink my own champagne or eat my own dog food or whatever the right metaphor is, right? So started my company really with that hope and desire and commitment. And 18 years in, it's been a really interesting journey. We've been certified as a great place to work for, I think, going on 9 years now. We've been on the Fortune Best Place to Work list for small and medium companies 3 times. We've been on the Inc. 5000 4 times. So we've had a pretty good run and learned a lot through that process. And yes, I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Nice. And you mentioned research. Can you talk a little bit to the research you've done on generations in the workplace recently?
Sure. We just published last week, actually, our latest survey data. We did a baseline survey in 2021, and it wasn't just around generations of work, but there was a lot of really interesting data that came out of that survey. Remember, in 21, that was, of course, height of pandemic, lots and lots of foment and issues going on in our society and all of those kinds of things. And at that moment in time, I think the survey was out in the market sometime in the April timeframe. And what we really heard from people then was we want businesses and our employer in particular to be good for me, like good for my well-being, good for my mental health, good for my work-life balance, all of that. Good for us. We want a workplace that is good for colleagues, for learning, for growth, culture, effective, high-performing cultures really is the headline out of that. And then, not surprising, good for the world. We want to work for employers and we want business, broadly speaking, to be good for the world. And, found that really interesting. We got a lot of really interesting feedback from clients and businesses that we work with and a lot of media coverage. So we thought this year we would redo that survey and see what had changed, what is the same, and what really we can draw from it that can help us essentially continue to build organizations where both the people and the business thrive. That really is the mission of my company, and that's what we do for clients. And very interesting, O'Brien, again, we didn't construct the survey specifically to look at generational differences or similarities, as the case may be, but a lot of really interesting generational insights came out of this data. So I'm here today and we can chat through any of those that you're interested in.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit, I guess, about broadly the differences and similarities. Like, are you seeing enough major differences that you're like, wow, these generations are really different in how they think about work? Or is it more just like, hey, we're kind of all the same and there's just some nuance to the human experience when it comes to work?
Yeah, this is a cheeky answer. Yes, it's all of what you just said, really. I think one of the things that we would say from the get-go is that the generations at work are much more similar than different, and more so now than in 2021. So for instance, in 2021, it was really millennials and Gen Z that were driving this broad scale kind of interest in mental health and well-being, particularly in the workplace, and a tremendous amount of focus in their write-in answers and the key informant interviews around all of those kinds of themes. Guess what? In the intervening 3 years, Gen X and boomers have caught up with millennials and Gen Z in terms of their interest in well-being, mental health, and these kinds of issues. In fact, I think I don't know if it would be statistically significant, but I think that the boomers were even higher on those factors than Gen X. I mean, I'm talking about 2 or 3 percentage points now.
Yeah, still.
Yeah. So I think that that's very interesting because I think, and again, we did a lot of key informant interviews also, and part of what we heard from those, as well as from the write-in comments, is that Gen X and boomers, honestly, it's their kids, their nieces and nephews, their colleagues, their neighbors that are in these younger generations. And they've learned, they've seen sort of the light, so to speak, of how important health and well-being is and mental health and well-being. And they have also gone through a lot. I mean, there's no question that the pandemic has left the world with a really interesting and really hard set of challenges around health and well-being and mental health and well-being. And so what we're seeing is that on those things where, I would say even a year ago, there's probably executives out there still that would say this, basically that what is it with all these young people? They want work to be primarily, they would even say easy, not be as taxing, that quiet quitting or whatever the thing was that came up. I think those kinds of things, while again, you talked about the clickbait, I think a lot of that is kind of clickbait stuff.
Yeah.
But what we're really seeing is that it's really a reaffirmation, but even a broadening of the affirmation that we saw in our first study in 21 of we want work that is good for us.
Yeah.
And right? We don't want work to be putting holes in our bucket. We want work that actually helps us have a full, rich, healthy life. And we feel like the best work is that kind of work.
Were you and I in our prep for this talking about the headlines about people not wanting to work anymore?
I don't recall that, but I have talked about others. Yeah.
I talked about it with somebody recently, and then I saw a video montage of this. But, there's this sentiment that, well, people don't want to work anymore. They don't want to come to the office. They don't want to work anymore. It feels like it's this new thing that when we were younger, people were hardworking. The reality is that you can find headlines going in major publications in this country, going back into the late 1800s, specifically verbatim saying employees don't want to work anymore.
Yes.
It's just this, again, clickbait. It's just this headline and this tagline like, oh, when we were younger, it was better. But it really wasn't. People have always wanted to do the least amount of somebody else's work that they could do to be able to live the best life for themselves that they want to live. Like that's human nature. And it's funny that we think this is some new thing, that in the Industrial Revolution, people were so hardworking. And it was like, no, everybody wants meaning and purpose, but everybody wants to do as little work for someone else as they need to.
Yeah. Part of that, just a sidebar, O'Brien, is really demographics as well. The baby boomers there was such a huge, huge number of workers in the workforce during the baby boom generation's peak work years, that jobs relative to number of participants in the workforce, jobs were a little more scarce. So the sense of like you had to work harder in order to there's some truth to that. I think for the boomers, there was a sense that if you were not going to be competing, that survival of the fittest, you weren't going to, all you do now is you look at the sizes of the generations, and we don't have that kind of surplus in our labor markets like we did. And particularly if you look at, I should have prefaced this, our study specifically looks at knowledge workers. So specifically, if you look at knowledge workers, there are some ups and downs. And yes, there's a lot of layoffs in the last 3 years in tech industry and that kind of thing. But when you look at our overall labor economy, we do not have a surplus of knowledge workers in the country, and not in the world either, for that matter. So this sense of like the capacity of people to say, this is what I want from my work, goes up pretty much in correlation with the level of scarcity in those skill sets. And I think that's part of what is often missed in these arguments is that demography. There's a phrase in demographic circles, demography is destiny. There's some real truth to that.
Yeah. Well, and that problem is not going to get any better in the foreseeable future, because if you look at the long-term demographic projections in the United States, we're basically flat. And so unless we change our immigration policy pretty significantly and open the borders to more knowledge workers, not the open borders necessarily the way that we have them now, don't want to get political, but being thoughtful in letting more people into this country to work, our demographics aren't going to go up. The number of workers we have in the economy is not going to go up. And that presents a whole host of challenges, one of which being that employees wind up having a little bit more power in determining what they want out of their work. Yes,
absolutely. Absolutely. There would be, some of us would say that that's not a bad thing, actually, even for business, right? The notion that businesses benefit when people don't have degrees of freedom or don't have, I actually think that's a fallacy. I think that's a fallacy, particularly in the knowledge work environment that we're all in. Yeah. But, you can always find an exception that proves the opposite or the rule, either one. But I think generally speaking, I don't think it's just wishful thinking that having organizations where both the people and the business thrive. I actually think there's a lot of data over the last really 30 years that shows that that's really true in many, many different ways of measuring those kinds of outcomes.
Yeah, well, I always think about Daniel Pink's book, Drive, which the basic premise for that book is we're not actually money motivated in the way that we think we are. And that for knowledge work, and even the most basic level of knowledge work, we actually perform better when we have consistent pay and we have pursuit of mastery, autonomy, and connection or purpose.
Absolutely. And that type of contour of what motivations really are most real for people, all of that is in our data as well, O'Brien. People care about things like pay and pay equity. Interestingly, when you asked me a moment ago about generations, what are the similarities and what are the differences? One of the things I found really interesting is that when it comes to a question like, I feel like I'm paid fairly at work, just guess which generation thinks that they're most likely paid fairly at work and which generation is the least likely to say I'm paid fairly at work. Just guess. Would you mind?
I would guess the boomers were most fairly paid and the Gen Z were least fairly paid.
It's just the opposite.
I figured that might be the case.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
The boomers, here we are. I'm a boomer. I'm barely a boomer, but I'm a boomer. Here we are sitting pretty, as my kids who are young millennials would say, with all of our 401ks and everything all accumulated. And we're basically saying, wait a minute, we don't have our fair share. Well, honestly, the Gen Z and millennials are like, yeah, I'm pretty okay. like I've got time but I feel like I'm getting my fair share, generally speaking. I found that really interesting.
Yeah.
Because I think there's a couple of things around that. One is that I think that there is generally a sense in younger generations of pay being one of several things that I care about very much. Like enough, you know what I mean? It's not necessarily the highest motivating factor. Things like, am I advancing my learning? Am I advancing my career? Do I have work-life balance? Do I have health and well-being? All of those kinds of things are as high, if not higher on the list than just pure pay.
Yeah. What are some of those other things then that are important? And are they important to everybody, or are they just important to certain generations?
Yeah, some of the things that are important to everybody, let's go to the kind of the stuff that we look for in kind of our organizational life, is we're looking for essentially cultures that walk the talk. So we're looking for cultures that are effective in communication, that have purpose and values that not necessarily are aligned to my values. And I'll come back to that.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good point. I wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah, we can come back to that. I'm looking for clear goals and objectives. I'm looking for opportunities to learn and to grow and achieve. I'm looking for effective leadership, role model leaders. I'm looking for great people managers. Again, this is not a list that would be different, O'Brien, than when you and I started our career X number of years ago, right? This is not rocket science. The thing that I find really interesting about all of that is when you look at our data through kind of a lens of like, well, how many of the folks that we surveyed across all the demographic roles, so we have senior leadership, HR leadership, people managers, and knowledge workers, so the frontline workforce. When you look across that, no surprise, but still a little disappointing, HR and business leadership thinks we're doing way better on those things than frontline people managers and knowledge workers. And the thing that I find really interesting and also a little hopeful is, again, this is not rocket science. This is stuff we really know how to do in business. We just need to do it better. And I think for me, part of that is
stuff some people know how to do in business.
Well, we've long said in our company, it's the soft stuff that's the hard stuff. I think Peter Drucker said that before I said it. But the truth is it isn't just even if we do know how to do it, it doesn't make it easy. But with focus and with prioritization, you actually can be really good at this stuff. And you see that in the differentiated results that some organizations get in their culture from investing in things like this.
Well, I think it's important to remember that these are all skills. And I've said this ad nauseum here, like everything about interacting with other people is a skill. And they're just like any skill, you can get better at that skill if you give it attention and practice and are purposeful in what you're doing. And so organizations and leaders, individuals who are paying attention to the people side of their business, they're going to get better at this stuff. And the people who are not paying attention to it, or it's too messy, or, can't we just do business? They're not going to get any better at it. And if employees are having more say and more choice out in the marketplace, your organization is not going to do as well.
Yeah, I agree with that so much, O'Brien. I've been thinking about this for several years, but I've been starting to talk about it more and even more with clients, is that I feel like there's so much we know, just like you just said, there's so much we know about what unlocks human potential, what unlocks human performance at the individual level and at the team level, at the organizational. I mean, there is lots to learn, but a lot about this we know. And yet, as organizations, we have not invested in making people leadership and people management like a practice, like something that some of our best people learn how to do that and then mentor others. Like it's kind of happenstance when people are really good at it. And we're like, oh yeah, that's so-and-so. Yeah, it's so interesting to me. And it feels like, honestly, if CEOs ask me all the time, what's one or two things we could do? I think this is one of the one or two things we could do differently, which is put real effort into creating a masterful practice of how you unlock the potential of others in your organization, and make sure that you develop that you hone that you lift that up, that you reward it commensurate with its value, which is enormous.
Yeah.
Another thing that I say in the research study is the future is human. I think that's the other thing that came through so clearly, the feedback from business leaders in particular, out of all we listed, I don't know, 20 or 30 business factors, supply chain, innovation, strategy, access to capital, blah, 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 all of the things, and a number of people issues as well. The people issues rose to the top. Culture, access to skills, leadership pipeline. I mean, leaders know that the future's human.
Yeah.
Even with all the new technology coming in, again, the jury is very much out how that's going to affect our world, but it's very clear that it's going to take human beings being ethical, kind, agile learners to be able to know how to master and deploy those technologies in a way that's good for the world. So anyway, I think that's just fascinating.
Yeah, I do too. And you hit on something there that I want to go back to, which is this concept that businesses are performance organizations. And I think we forget that a little bit. Like, I'm in a performance job. I'm in a sales job. And so we talk about performance all the time. And I have conversations with my peers about what it means to be a corporate athlete and how you take care of your mind and your body. And, I'm not out on a basketball court or anything like that, but I need my mind, and my mind is part of my body, and I need those things to perform well. And so sleep and nutrition and exercise are important elements of how I do my job at work. And then there's also all the skills and everything that you need at work. And just little stuff like how you project manage the tasks that you have. I think we forget that every role in the organization is there to help from a performance standpoint. And there are a few HR leaders who do think like this, and it's really fun and engaging to hear the work that they're doing, where they're like experts on human performance, and they think about how to bring in top talent, cultivate top talent, and they think of it from a real like talent performance standpoint. But even I think senior executives aren't thinking about employees that way. They're not thinking about having a team of athletes and how do you coach and develop those athletes to be really high performers out on the field. And I think the organizations that do that, it feels better. They get to hold a higher standard, and people meet that standard willingly because they're intrinsically motivated versus the like cudgel of trying to nag people to do the right thing all the time. Does that make sense?
Totally. I agree. Totally. You said it very well. And I think that that's what I am trying to get at when I say it. We understand, we really know so much now about how to unlock human potential at the individual level, but even more so in teams, in organizations, right? That should be a practice, a performance-based practice where we can tell this person as a leader does a much better job of unleashing the organization than this person. Okay, how can we help that person get better at it, right?
Yeah.
We know these things, and we should be really investing beyond that kind of manager 101 compliance, make sure you do all of your paperwork type of training, which is so much of the manager 101 type training. We could develop managers and leaders along these lines. And I think we would see incredibly differentiating performance outcomes in our organizations for doing so.
Yeah, I love that. That'll be the rallying cry. You and I will be out on our soapboxes in the public square calling that message out. So we put a pin in your comment before about what employees want from a value standpoint. I want to make sure that we go back to that and don't leave that one on the table, because I think that's interesting. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. So one of the things we saw in our 21 data was that the vast majority of people said, yeah, I want to work for a company that embodies my values. Now, again, remember where we were at the beginning of 2021, right? There was a lot of social unrest, a lot of things happening in the world around the pandemic that had a lot of overlay with values and other things of that nature. And so there was definitely a sense that in 2021, folks wanted to see values in their businesses aligned to their own. In fact, in 21, it was about 3/4 of knowledge workers in particular that said that they wanted to see those values embodied in their company that aligned with their own. We saw a 12% drop in knowledge workers in particular this year in that particular area. And we saw it in a couple of other dimensions too, like for instance, in DEI. DEI was one of those things that was seen as quite positive across the board a few years ago in 21 and now less so, particularly for knowledge workers. I'll come back to it. Business leaders actually are up like 16 points, percentage points in 3 years on the importance of DEI for their organization. So that's an interesting dilemma there.
Yeah.
I will say that I think what we've seen in the change in values alignment is really being driven primarily by older workers, over 45-year-olds in particular. We saw a 16-point change in the last 3 years in those 45-year and older workers saying that the values are important. Gen Z and millennials are still pretty consistently saying, yep, no, I want to work for a company that embodies my values. So it's a really interesting thing, O'Brien. I personally think that there's a sense of maybe some disillusionment, maybe a little bit of cynicism there was a lot of heady commitments made in the 21 timeframe around all kinds of things. And maybe there's kind of a bit of a swing back or even a step back against some of those things in those older generations. However, what's very interesting is that for the younger generations, these things don't appear to be changing much at all. Actually, they are equally committed to DEI as they were 3 years ago, if not a little bit more, equally committed to wanting to work for value-based companies and companies that are aligned to their own values. So I think that it really is those older, over 45 workers that have gone through something and are feeling maybe a little bit cynical,
Those curmudgeon-y old people.
Maybe a little disillusioned from the heightened sense of the last few years and not sure kind of that all of that is as wise as it seemed like it was at the time. So
well, and there's plenty of organizations that did just give it lip service. So I think that is fair on a lot of occasions. Want to dive a little deeper into the values piece of this, though, because there's two ways to think about this, at least in my mind. Does the organization embody my values? Like, do we treat each other well? Do we have some purpose? Are we collaborative? It's like the way we operate within the business aligns with my values. And then there's the more external facing, the business makes statements to the public that align with my values. And I think there's hesitancy, or there's an image now that younger workers want to work for a place that will take a stand on all public issues that aligns with their specific political beliefs. So one, I'm curious, like, is that really true? And then the sort of more foundational question is like, is it that we want a place where internally it aligns with our values, or do we want a place that externally aligns with our values, or both?
I think it's both. What I would say, if you just think about business leaders in particular, 65% of business leaders said their employers should take a public stand on societal issues. And that was actually an increase of 14% from 2021.
Whoa.
So I think
that surprises me.
Isn't that interesting? And I think the reality is, and again, we did a lot of key informant interviews around these questions, O'Brien, and what we heard from business leaders on this and the DEI piece and on the Force for Good piece is, I think that business leaders have gotten the message from the Edelman Trust Barometer. Gallup does some work around this. Pew does some work around this. Our little survey does some work on this, that there is moral capital that has been invested in business leadership in this country. It's been growing over years. It's now at a pretty stable level and really higher than most of our other societal institutions, certainly higher than government, certainly higher than, by some measures, religious institutions, higher than nonprofit institutions, et cetera. And I think that business leaders have really, I talked to several of them that talked about the stories that were told in their company post George Floyd that just really awakened them to the reality of racism in ways that they hadn't understood. Or even earlier after the Pulse massacre about what happens to LGBTQ people in the world. I think the kind of listening that happened in organizations at that time and the kind of openness. And then honestly, more than one business leader said to me, and my kids have taken me to task on this.
Yeah.
Or niece and nephew, or my kids' friends, right? So I remember, this is several years ago, actually not related to this, but I remember talking to one of the executives, British Petroleum, who went through quite a conversion around climate change. And when you asked him what happened, it was his own children that brought him to task over it. So the point I guess I'm making is that I do think that business leaders have really taken this on at a level of seriousness, and that it's coming from a place of authentic engagement personally. And for many of them, I'm not saying that this is true for all of them. I think for the workforce more broadly, again, if you look at the knowledge workers in particular, again, it's what I said a moment ago. It really is this over 45 demographic that's basically kind of saying, yeah, good values are important, but I don't necessarily need, I'm not feeling like I did 3 years ago about how important it is that my employer takes a stand. Yeah. Under 45, still very important to those folks, very important to those folks. Another piece is just, we asked people about how important is it that companies provide a forum for learning and dialogue on these issues. All respondents basically say, yeah, we would, over half of respondents, 66%, up 9% from 21 on that. So, there's a lot in the zeitgeist around sort of the backlash to some of these things over the coming years. And some of that is very real. I'm not making light of that at all. But I think we're seeing some deep changes in the way that businesses and business leadership thinks about their moral authority in the world, and then the responsibility that comes with that.
So how do you think about some of the headlines that we've heard recently around Harley Davidson or Ford Motor Company or Bud Light or like other organizations who have come under fire for some of their DEI policies and who have actually backtracked on those? Like, how does that fit into, we don't need to get too political, but like, how does that fit into the data that you're seeing? Like, how do you make sense of that?
I think there's kind of three dimensions to it, is what I would observe. I think one is that people are responding to their customers, because there are customer demographics that probably fit different companies and it may not be all their customers, but there may be a subset that are very vocal. That's one. Second, and I think this is, maybe a distinction without a difference from some people's point of view, but the truth is I think it is quite a difference, is that when organizations are saying we're moving away from DEI programs, I think they're not necessarily moving away from inclusion and equity and diversity, right? It's really the programmatic focus of those things became a lightning rod.
Yeah, and that we're going to force people through some kind of training.
Yeah, which the data has been clear for many years that stuff is really not very effective, and in some cases actually takes us in the wrong direction in terms of reinforcing stereotypes and things like that. So again, I can't say that I've talked to any of those companies personally, O'Brien, but I do know that organizations in my purview who are really taking a hard look at what happened over the last 3 years have, in some ways, their words, not mine, doubled down on diversity, equity, and inclusion, while also taking out those words from programmatic activities in the company that felt like that they were a lightning rod for things that were really creating a distraction from the real work of creating inclusive, equitable, diverse workplaces with psychological safety being kind of right at the top of the list of how they're characterized. And then the third thing I would say, the third thing I would say about that is that I think that it is the case that these things do come on a pendulum. Clearly, what happened in 2020, 2021, and even early 22, the pendulum swung way far one way. There may be a few of these companies that are now taking it back the other way fairly drastically, but I'm guessing even in some of those organizations over time, there's no question that these are really important values to a really high percentage of the under 45 workforce in particular. And guess what? If that's the workforce, that's also your customers in many, many cases. So we'll probably see the pendulum swing back a little bit over the course of time.
Yeah, I think it might be important to remember too, that this is, people want to work in a place that's aligned with their values, not one arbitrary set of values. I remember, was it Coinbase, I think, made the public statement that they were not going to take a position on any social or political issues. They were not going to allow that conversation at work. You were there to work, and they want to create a good environment, but those conversations were not going to take place. And they lost, I think, a third of their workforce, like in the next 2 or 3 months. And that was the big headline. But the follow-up headline is that they actually were inundated with applications from people who said, you know what, that's the kind of place I want to work in, a cutting edge tech environment, crypto, but I don't want to deal with any of this nonsense that's going out over here. Sure, I may care about it, but like, I don't want to deal with it at work. I don't want to swim in it all the time. They found plenty of people to fill those jobs. So it got a little rocky for, maybe 3 months, but they were actually able to find people who better aligned with their corporate values, that those corporate values also better aligned with their personal values. As long as you're purposeful around what you're trying to do, like, you can find people who value those things.
Absolutely. And we did ask a lot of questions about, what are the things that people find valuable for employers to take a stand on. Things like environmental and climate come up the list, employee health and well-being, community engagement, ethical practices, charitable donations, particularly in the communities where we work and live, and social responsibility around DEI and LGBTQ. But again, much more around safety and support, a supportive atmosphere versus necessarily taking stands on issues external. Now, I would say that, most of the organizations that ended up taking a lot of those stands didn't know they were going to do it until confronted with the choice, and candidly, at least every organization I worked with, without exception, took those stands out of a sense of real moral conviction at the senior level and even at the board level. And because they heard incredible depth of feeling from their workforce around this. So that these things were not taken lightly, but they were in many ways created perfect storms of that in our polarized environment are going to create that kind of turbulence. And I wouldn't say that people necessarily would do it again the way that we did it, but that was a moment in time that felt like it was absolutely necessary.
Yeah. Let's get back into the generations piece of this. Sort of, we'll climb out of that rabbit hole and maybe dig another one. You had talked about what was similar between generations. What do you see as the biggest differences? And let's start with Gen Z, just because there's so much buzz around Gen Z right now. Like, what are the actual differences that make up Gen Z versus prior generations?
Well, our data doesn't look at every aspect of the way that Gen Z, kind of portrays themselves,
Sure.
Or, belief systems. I can tell a few things that we found is, one is that Gen Z is actually pretty enthusiastic about their employers and their workplace. In our data, Gen Z is a kind of a stereotype of a bit of a cynicism or kind of a critique or whatever. But in our data, they were quite enthusiastic. 3 in 4 believe their company treats employees fairly, and 83% have confidence in their manager's leadership. And 3 in 4, more than 3 in 4, see themselves working at their employer in 2 years' time. So there's a kind of a strong level of commitment, interest, positivity there. I think another place is around flexibility. We asked a lot of questions around where people are working, whether or not flexibility matters to them, et cetera. Flexibility in the workplace is not just a perk for Gen Z. It really is a necessity. And yet a lot of organizations kind of operate with the assumption that Gen Z need to be in traditional office settings in order to earn the right to have that flexibility. Actually, Gen Z has, more than any other generation, feels like that they've earned the right to have flexibility when and how they work. And they don't want to only work remotely. More than 2/3 prefer a hybrid environment, but the point that I would make is that they really do want that sense of efficacy and self-actualization that comes from being a part of the choice making in how they work. So those kinds of hybrid models are really, really important to Gen Z. Another place that we found it interesting, and I've seen some other data, not just in our survey, but in others, is that Gen Z is pretty skeptical about AI. More skeptical, weirdly, than millennials, much more skeptical than millennials. Part of what I would observe about Gen Z is that while both of those generations are so-called digital natives, Gen Z sort of has been coming of age in the time frame where we've really been dancing with the dark side, so to speak, of all of the social media and everything that has been part of our world. And
they're the social media natives.
Yes. And it's made them extremely, well, maybe not extremely, definitely skeptical of AI and how positive AI will be in the work environment.
Yeah. I was listening to an interview with one of the authors from the book, The Coddling of the American Mind. And he has a couple other books out too. And he was talking about surveying groups of students like in college. So would be Gen Z. And he said, I think it might have been high school too. And he said that he would ask the question, who would be willing to give up their social media? And like almost nobody's hand went up. And they said, who wishes social media was never invented? And almost all the hands went up. And so it's this, we're in this weird thing where everybody's doing it because everybody's doing it, but nobody wants it. And it is this really weird place. And so I could totally see them being more skeptical.
Yeah. I think that's another piece about this, about the hybrid work is Gen Z is very eager for human connection and human community, friendships, that kind of thing. So Gen Z would like to be in the work environment with other colleagues, but they just don't want to be told exactly how to do it all the time in a way that's differentiated for their stage of life and career.
Because human beings don't like arbitrary rules.
They do not. Yeah. Imagine that. And younger ones probably like arbitrary rules even less.
Yeah. Well, and we've shown that a lot of arbitrary rules are just that over the last couple of years. And so now it's like, well, wait, if those were arbitrary rules, what else is arbitrary? And we don't want to go back to just get crammed into somebody else's box because that's what they feel like. We're okay doing the work and showing up, but we want some autonomy. We want to have a voice in it.
Yeah.
Again, autonomy, back to Daniel Pink's thing about motivation. Autonomy is one of the big motivational drivers.
Absolutely. This is a sidebar. It's not specific to the generations, but in our data, by a full 10 percentage points, people that work a hybrid or remote job are much more likely to say that they have a good people manager.
Oh, interesting.
Just that by itself. So why is that? And a couple people that we interviewed through our key informant interviews said that they thought it was probably just the reality of the autonomy that people have.
Yeah.
When they're not having to go into the workforce every day or workplace every day. So I find that to be a really interesting finding.
Yeah. So how do you think about the concept of giving people what they want and giving people what they need? Because this is something I think about when it comes to hybrid work or when it comes to generations in the workplace, especially Gen Z. Like, there were a lot of people coming out of the pandemic who did not want to go back to the workplace. And they said, no, I don't want to do it. And they were complaining about it. And then everybody I talked to, when we were actually in the office, they said, you know what? This does feel really good. They said, I do like being here and being social. Again, I don't want to do it every day. I don't want to be told to do it every day, but I do feel better when I'm in the office around people. Like we had a big conversation about it at one of our social events, and everybody in the room agreed that we all feel good when we're around other people. And I think we can also agree that there's all kinds of learning that happens when we're working with other people. So how should leaders who are designing their workplaces think about marrying this concept of giving autonomy and listening to survey data like the ones that you just put out, and also sort of what we know about human performance and human happiness and well-being, that, we need to give people what they need versus what they want?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things I've been thinking for the last few years is if work can be done from anywhere, it will be and probably should be. And the reality is that I think we can co-create with our colleagues, with our workforces, if we're business leaders, co-create really meaningful, lore-creating in-person experiences that actually create the kind of social cohesion and the kind of psychological safety and the kind of environment for growth mindset and learning and achievement, all the things we know about human performance, we can do that without telling people that they have to come in Monday, Wednesday, and Friday every work week. And it's really kind of on us to work with our people to figure that out, because it's really clear that I think exactly what you've said is right. People want to have meaningful time with their colleagues at work, but the emphasis there needs to be on meaningful time. What is that? Some people have coined that moments that matter. I actually think it's more than moments. I think it's experiences. I use this phrase, lore creating experiences, because you can remember it weeks, months, years later. We were together. We had this experience. We learned together. We built all this trust, whatever, right? And that doesn't mean that that has to be just an event. That can be like every quarter we get together this way or whatever, right? It's not just a one-time thing. But I think it really is up to it. It's so ironic, isn't it, O'Brien? Like the companies that are actually have invented, are inventing and creating the environment where we all can work from anywhere are among the ones that are really unnerved by people actually doing it. So we got to get better at this. I think we really have to apply the same level of innovation and ingenuity that we have to our products and software and think about what do we know about human beings and what makes them tick. We can create meaningful collegial relationships that have in-person time, but that don't require people being in the office on a set schedule. We can do that. We have to put that out in front of us because when you look at the cost in people's lives, the additional childcare, the wear and tear through long commutes, the increase in housing prices, if everybody has to live near their jobs. I mean, these are also real costs to people, real costs. They're not nothing. They're a lot in terms of what diminishes people's capacity and joy, as well as just their ability to do the work that we want them to do. So we really have to look at the whole picture.
Yeah. All right. Let's pivot back out of that one a little bit, because there's this concept that you and I had talked about in prep around the generations. There are a lot of people who think about Gen Z right now and they think, oh, they don't know how to talk to people. They can't write very well. They don't want to work very hard. There's all these things that are coming out. What do you have to say to the people who are down on Gen Z right now?
Well, I mean, check your ego at the door and get to know some people. I mean, look, it's kind of like you were saying earlier, O'Brien, I think there's a danger. It's a very human thing to look back on our own early selves with nostalgia and think, oh, we were never like that. Surely we were never like that.
Yeah.
I wasn't like that and I didn't know anybody. I mean, that's ridiculous. That's ridiculous. So I would say the first thing is really approach people of different generations and all kinds of differences with a lot of humility and compassion and empathy and curiosity. Understand what really makes the folks in your organization of these different generations, what makes them tick and what they're really interested in. It's really important, I think, also to do your own homework about your own biases, your own, sort of mental models and how you need to, as a leader in particular and a people manager, what can you do to change and be more open and really demonstrate a growth mindset around the generations in your workplace? Another couple of things that are more programmatic. I know a lot of organizations that have gotten a lot of value out of reverse mentoring or other kinds of programs like that create conversation circles or skip level circles that really help people talk across different levels in the organization, but inevitably that ends up being different ages as well. Those kinds of ongoing conversations can be very, very helpful. And then the last thing I would say is to really watch and observe the folks in your Gen Z and millennial cohorts that are achieving and find out what's creating the conditions for them to do their best work, because that is probably a good hint about how to, if you've got folks in your workforce that don't seem to be motivated, why is that? And what can we do to change that motivation profile so that they can contribute at the level of their capability? Yeah,
I love all of that. I just think, so I'm an older millennial and I'm on the elbow, between Gen X and millennials, but I fall a couple years into the millennial bucket and I'm 40 years old. When I started in the workplace, it was kind of like the Gen Zers who are in now, and everybody was whining about the millennials and we didn't want to work and we didn't have these skills and everything. And it's, at the time, I just felt so off from the people I knew in my generation. And now I hear it again. I'm like, wait a minute, this is the same talk. It can't be the same. Yeah. You know, it's the same talk track. And so my belief is we're all moving through different stages in life. And the things that are important to a baby boomer now are important because of their age and stage in life and the experiences they've had. Those same things, or a lot of them, are going to be important to Gen Xers in the next few years and to millennials a couple of years after that. And the things, they might be a little bit different as far as what a new employee needs. But, you know, anyone who's coming out of college or high school into a job, they're green as green can be, and they're going to need etiquette lessons and what it means to be a good worker, and they're going to need to be developed. And I mean, I remember sitting next to an English major who was a couple years older than me, and I was writing emails, and she would edit my emails, and I would show them, she would give them back just so marked up, and she'd be like, this is crap. And, you know, I got way better writing because I sat next to her in one of my first jobs and was very grateful for that. And so I just think people complain about, oh, it's the generation. It's like, no, it's just where they are in their stage. And it's just lazy not to go down and help those people. Yeah, it can be frustrating, but it's also a development opportunity. And if we're performance organizations and we're performance minded, like we talked about before, that's just an opportunity to improve performance. You know, and sure, there will be some people who can't do the job or just are in the wrong job, or you got to get rid of them. And like, that's fine. That'll always happen. But like, everybody needs to be developed. And yeah, I don't know. I just think it's more life stage than generation.
Yeah, you know, it's very interesting. I'll just add one thing to that. I think that's so spot on, O'Brien. And the thing that I find really having, now 18 years into my business, hired and mentored, you know, hundreds of people, as well as, of course, in client situations. It's amazing how many times we think people know and they just don't know.
Yeah.
You have to actually make your expectations explicit. Yeah. And, you know, if you do that early and often, so that people have a chance to show you that they can do what you want them to do, it's amazing how often it actually works out better.
Yeah.
So you see someone, wow, that person just doesn't show up in the way that I think, you know, approach with curiosity and compassion, demonstrate empathy, but make the performance standards clear. If you aren't able to articulate what it is that you want from this person, then, you know, you need to really think about, is this just bias clouding my view?
Yeah. And to the point about arbitrary stuff, why it's important.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. I heard a guy tell a story about a young employee that he had. This was probably 10 years ago. The person was a collegiate football player, and they were really excited that they had hired him because they had a lot of athletes come into the organization and do really well. And the guy was showing up late all the time. And they were like, I think we got to fire him. And someone was like, well, has anybody given him the feedback? And it was like, well, you know, we've like suggested it and we've hinted it. They're like, this guy's like 6'4", 200 and something pounds football player. Like, he's been yelled at his whole life. Like, that's what he responds to. So the guy, the owner of the company, pulled him in the office. He's like, why the hell are you late all the time? And he was like, what do you mean? And he's like, start time's 9:00. You need to be here at 8:50. If you're on time, you're late. And the guy was like, okay. And he never showed up late again.
Yeah.
You know, he didn't scream at him, but he just like, he gave him the tough love. And the guy was like, oh, okay. Yeah. And he was totally coachable. It's just that nobody had wanted to give this big guy the coaching.
Yeah. People can't read our minds. We might want them to, but they can't. We've got to make it explicit.
Yeah. I know we're running out of time here. What do people get wrong the most when it comes to interpreting the data that you've put out there?
You know, I think it's very broadly what we're just talking about, honestly, O'Brien, is that, and have touched on a few different times in this conversation, is I think people trade in stereotypes versus actual getting to know the actual human beings. And yes, we can learn something about what people tell us through surveys and other things like that about what's different and distinct about being in these different age cohorts. But the most important insight is, one, is we have way more in common than we have different, number one. And beyond that, we can learn from each other. The differences are actually opportunities for learning. They're not we shouldn't default to feeling that they're opportunities for disconnects. They're opportunities for connection and learning. And that's really the key takeaway I would like to leave people with.
Well, I think that is a great place to end on. Cheryl, thank you so much for coming on the show. We will link to your website and everything in the show notes for people who want to engage with you. But where's the best place for people to find you and keep this conversation going with you if they need a little bit more help in their organization?
Sure. My email is Cheryl@bluebeyondconsulting.com, Cheryl, since Cheryl is sometimes spelled a different way. And you can get the full report of the research that we talked about today that I haven't touched on probably even half of it today at our website, bluebeyondconsulting.com. You can download it on the homepage.
And we will put both of those in the show notes for anybody who wants access to them. And hope this has been an educational and inspiring conversation for all of you listening. As always, thank you for listening. And Cheryl, thank you for being a great guest.
Thank you. Thanks so much, O'Brien.
Hey folks, one last thing before you go. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure to hit subscribe so you can stay up to date with future guests. That's it. Thanks for coming. Go make the most of your business and the people in it.